Hello students! Today we are in the last section of chapter 3 looking at equilibrium in the market. So the two sides of the market are supply and demand. We developed each one of them separately in the earlier episodes. Now we're going to put them together. And this is enormously important. A skill you'll need not just in this course but also in all your future econ classes. So define the market equilibrium, often just stated as equilibrium, as where supply meets demand. So here's our supply curve. Remember, supply slopes upward because of the law of supply. When price goes up, firms want to supply more. Demand slopes down because of the law of demand. When things get more expensive, consumers buy less of them. So where the two curves intersect is the equilibrium. So we call P star the equilibrium price. It's sometimes called the market clearing price. Q star is the equilibrium quantity, aka market clearing quantity. So just to remind you of our abbreviations, we often use P for price and Q for quantity. We also tend to use S for supply and D for demand. So these two graphs here are showing you the exact same thing. The one on the right here is just using the abbreviations, while the one on the left, it's all been written out. So in this chapter, because you're brand new to this stuff, I have written it out in a lot of cases. However, you will want to get used to the abbreviations since they are very standard in economics, and we will start relying upon them in this class as well. So the natural tendency in a market to go to equilibrium. The two other cases are when the price is above the equilibrium price and when the price is below the equilibrium price. So we call those surpluses and shortages. We'll consider each one. So in the graph over here, price is at P prime. That's above the equilibrium price. Equilibrium would be where supply and demand meet. That would be somewhere down here. So at P prime, quantity demanded, QD, is back here. Consumers only want to buy this much. However, the producers are trying to supply QS, which is out here. You see where does P prime meet the supply curve? And they supply this much. So there's more than enough stuff being produced. Suppliers actually have some things left over after all the consumers have bought what they wanted. That's a surplus because there is extra supply. Some books call it excess supply. That's another common term to be aware of. Now, the suppliers don't like having a lot of extra goods that they can't sell. They produce things in order to sell them. Having stuff just sit in a warehouse collecting dust is not very profitable for them. So how do they sell this extra stuff they've made? Well, just go to our law of demand. To get consumers to buy stuff, you gotta slash the price. So suppliers start lowering the price. That's going to entice more consumers to start buying. Also, if price goes down, some suppliers are going to realize that producing more is not worth it, and they're going to start cutting back on production. So as price keeps going down, consumers keep buying more, and producers keep supplying less, and that's going to continue until supply and demand equal, which will be over here, which is the market price. So in a market, a surplus is not going to last very long. Prices will adjust to bring us back into equilibrium. The same is true for a shortage. So this graph is showing you what that would look like. P prime is the price that is, in this case, below the equilibrium price. Equilibrium is where supply and demand meet, that'd be over here. So if price is low, that means that consumers are trying to buy this much. Just look at where does the price meet that demand curve. So they want to buy this quantity. The sellers are going to supply this much. You can find that by seeing where does P prime meet our supply curve. You can see that consumers are trying to buy a bigger amount than producers are selling. So the stores are going to run out of goods, and there'll still be consumers trying to find more. So because they run out, we call that a shortage. This case is also not sustainable in the market. Prices will adjust to bring us back to equilibrium. Here's how that would happen. Suppliers like getting a higher price for stuff. They love to say the same thing and make more money while doing so. If they can already sell everything they're making at the current price, they can try to raise it and still sell everything they're making. So suppliers will want to raise prices. When suppliers raise prices, that's going to incentivize firms to produce more, expanding production, hiring more workers, paying overtime, building bigger factories can be profitable when prices are high enough. So there'll be more goods being supplied. Consumers, on the other hand, don't like high prices. Some consumers will start to say, it's not worth it anymore. I'm not willing to buy. So as price goes up, more suppliers are going to jump in and produce more goods. Some consumers are going to drop out. That's going to continue until supply and demand equal and you're at the equilibrium. So in short, if price is below the equilibrium, it's going to rise until you get to equilibrium. If price is too high, if it's above the equilibrium, it's going to fall until you return to equilibrium. That's why I said earlier the market naturally goes to equilibrium. You can also look at this mathematically. So I showed you graphs where you're just trying to find where supply and demand intersect. You could also get an equation for supply. Let's say supply is P equals 3 plus Q. The equation for demand is P equals 10 minus Q. So your mission here is to find the market equilibrium, P star and Q star. So that means where supply and demand equal each other. So go ahead and pause the video here and work through that. When you think you have the answer, press play and we'll see if you're right. Okay, let's go over the answer. So we have two equations, supply equation, demand equation. We have two unknowns, P and Q. So two equations, two unknowns should be solvable most of the time. We have a P over here and a P over there, so we can just substitute that out. So we get 3 plus Q equals 10 minus Q, our first equation. We can do some reshuffling. So I subtracted 3 from both sides to get the 7 over here. Then I added Q to both sides, so I get 2Q. Last step is to divide both sides by 2, and I get Q equals 7 over 2. This is the solution. This is the equilibrium. So I give it a star, so I call it Q star is 7 over 2, which is 3.5. Fractions or decimals are equally acceptable, by the way. Sometimes people ask me about that. As long as it's the right number, whether it's in fraction form or decimal form, I'm happy. In your test, though, it's all going to be multiple choice, so you don't have to worry about that. Alright, so we found the equilibrium quantity, Q star. We also have to find the equilibrium price. To do that, you plug in Q star into either supply or demand. It doesn't actually matter which one you use. That's because in equilibrium, supply equals demand. You should get the same answer either way. So I just picked supply in my example here, but if you'd chosen demand, you would have gotten the same thing. So P equals 3 plus Q, but we said Q is 7 over 2, so 3 plus 7 over 2 is going to be 6 over 2 plus 7 over 2, which is 13 over 2. That should be 6.5. 3 plus 3.5 is 6.5. So that's how you can solve this mathematically. Now, there is one thing to watch out for when you're going back and forth between the math and your graphs. So, we often use linear supply and demand just for simplicity. Of course, in real life it could be nonlinear, but the same principles all hold true. So in economics, we put price on the y-axis over here, and we put quantity on the x-axis. Now, you're graphing a straight line. You usually do that in slope-intercept form. So in slope-intercept form, you have to isolate the y on one side, so the equation that's on, so the variable that's on this side of the graph, this would be price in economics. And you have mx plus b, the other stuff, on the other side. That would go over here. If you had x equals 8y plus c, that would not be slope-intercept form. Again, you got to isolate y, not isolate x when you're doing slope-intercept. So in economics, we have price on the y-axis, so you want to isolate the p. That's just like trying to isolate the y when you're doing slope-intercept with your graphs. So you want to make sure you have p on one side and you have the other stuff on the other side. In this case, you don't have it in the right form. You have a q on this side. So negative 10 in that case would not be your intercept, and 5 would not be your slope. Again, you got to isolate p. You can't isolate q. So if you do have something in that form where you have the q being isolated or something else like that, you just got to do some rearranging. So in this case, here's how you would tackle it. We can first just add 10 to both sides. So now we have a q plus 10 equals 5p. To isolate p, the next step you got to do is divide both sides by 5. So now we get 1/5 q. 10 over 5 is 2, so you have a plus 2 over there. So now I've isolated the p, and now I have slope-intercept form. My intercept is going to be 2, and my slope is 1/5. So your big takeaway, when you're graphing supply or graphing demand, isolate p. Have a p on one side, all the other stuff on the other side. So as long as you just isolate p, you'll be fine. So now we get to a critical skill in this course, something that might be, without exaggeration, the most important thing you'll learn in this entire course. So the market equilibrium can change if things in the market change. So what you want to be able to do is read some story, read some scenario, and you want to figure out what's going to happen to price and what's going to happen to quantity. So here's the process you want to follow to do that. You want to figure out, first of all, which curve is going to shift. Does it shift supply? Does it shift demand? Does it shift both? To do that, you just go to the list of factors we had for what shifts supply and what shifts demand. A lot of students just try to guess which one will move, but because you're so new to economics, your intuition is not very well developed yet, and that kind of guessing doesn't usually go very well. Just stick to those lists of which factors I gave you that shift supply and which factors shift demand. Follow that and you won't go astray. So once you figure out if supply is shifting or if demand is shifting, the next thing you got to do is figure out which direction is it shifting. Is it shifting out or is it shifting back? Next step, draw the graph. A lot of my students skip this step, but I do not recommend that. The graph really does help you see what's going on. So definitely draw graphs. They are there to help you. The graph will then show you if the price goes up or if the price goes down. It will also show you what happens to the quantity. Will the quantity go up or will the quantity go down? So we'll start here with an example. I'll just work through this one for you guys, and once you've seen how that works, you can tackle some examples on your own. So Thanksgiving, we traditionally celebrate that by eating turkey. After Thanksgiving though, that's going to be very different. What's going to happen to the market for turkey after Thanksgiving? So in our process here, we got to first figure out which curve is going to shift. Is that supply or is that demand? Let's go to our list of factors. So here's a list we developed in the earlier episodes. We said income shifts demand, related goods shift demand, consumer tastes shift demand. That sounds relevant. So our preferences for turkey get a lot weaker after Thanksgiving. With this big surge in interest in turkey on Thanksgiving, afterwards though, our interest drops. So that's a change in consumer tastes. Now that's in our list of factors that shift demand. So we know that demand is going to shift. So the next step in our procedure was we want to figure out the direction of the shift. Does demand shift out or does demand shift back? So if we're buying less turkey after Thanksgiving, that means demand is shifting back. So now we know the direction of the shift as well. Now we got to draw a graph. So here I have the supply curve, which is not shifting. D0 is the old demand, and then we're starting out over here. Once Thanksgiving passes and we become less interested in turkey, demand shifts back, and now our new demand curve here is D1. So this arrow is showing that shift. So that's step 3. We drew our graph. Now we got to figure out what happens to price and what happens to quantity. So the equilibrium is where supply meets demand. So originally that's going to be over here. Here's where old demand is and here's where supply is. So price would be up there. After demand shifts back, the curves now intersect down here. So that means that price is going to fall. So we expect to see stores offering discounts on turkey after Thanksgiving. And that's indeed what you do see happening in the real world. You also see a decrease in quantity. So they have a massive amount of turkey being offered in stores before Thanksgiving, but afterwards it's a lot harder to find. Old supply, old demand meet over here, so old quantity is going to be there, Q0 star. So Q0 is old, so 0 is the original, and a star is for equilibrium, so we start over here. We used to buy this much. Once demand shifts back, now those two curves are meeting over here. So new quantity is going to be Q1. That's a decrease in Q. So price should go down and quantity should also go down. And that's what happens in grocery stores after Thanksgiving. So one thing that some of my students occasionally do, they figure, okay, so if price goes down, that's going to mean that suppliers will start producing less, so then supply is going to shift back, but then if supply shifts back, that's going to shift demand. They get themselves all tangled up. What is the flaw in that reasoning? Well, if price goes down, that does not shift supply. When price goes down, that gives you a movement along the supply curve. We talked about that earlier. Let me just pull up that slide really quickly. That was back. Back over here. So a price change gives you a movement along the supply curve. So prices do go down, but that does not shift supply. We still have that same supply curve we had before Thanksgiving. We're just picking a different point on it because now people are buying fewer turkeys than they were previously. So that's our turkey example. Be sure to tune in for our next episode, in which we'll look at a lot more examples and get some practice in working with supply and demand.